What would you do if the most feared man alive asked you to wear his ring for exactly one night, because he was certain nobody would ever look at you twice, and then watched, along with every dangerous man in the room, as you walked through that door and quietly took ownership of every inch of it? He had chosen her because she was safe, invisible, forgettable, a soft, curvy accountant who kept her eyes down and her opinions quieter, the one woman in his entire organization he was certain no one would notice. He was wrong, and the instant his rivals could not stop watching her, neither, to his own horror, could he. This is a story of hidden worth, of a woman told her whole life to disappear, and of the ruthless man who tried to use her as camouflage and found himself kneeling before a queen. Margot Winslow had spent 31 years being furniture. She was the senior accountant for a legitimate shipping firm that everyone in the city knew was something else entirely, and for 4 years she had sat in a windowless office on the 14th floor, soft and generously curved and deliberately unremarkable, wearing shapeless gray cardigans that swallowed her figure whole. It was armor, and she knew it. Once, long ago, she had been someone brighter. But the world had spent her girlhood explaining, gently and then not gently, that a woman built like her had two choices: be laughed at or be invisible. Margot had chosen invisible, and she had gotten so good at it that people said things in front of her they should not have said, the way they might in front of a lamp. Nobody saw what she actually was, because inside that gray cardigan lived a mind that could read a ledger the way other people read a face. She caught things. She caught everything. Rounding errors that were not errors, shipments that arrived before they departed, a vendor whose invoices all fell on the same suspicious Tuesday. She had, over 4 quiet years, saved the organization more money than any capo had ever earned it, and not one soul above her had ever said thank you, because Margot Winslow was a lamp. Her supervisor took the credit, the executives took the bonuses, and Margot took the overtime, and went home to a small apartment, and told herself this was enough. Then, on an ordinary rainy Thursday, the temperature on the 14th floor dropped 20 degrees. Conversation died mid-syllable, and Margot looked up from her spreadsheets to find the most dangerous man in the city standing in the doorway of her windowless office, watching her with dark, unreadable eyes. She had no idea he had come to ask her the strangest question of her life, or that saying yes would set the entire underworld on fire. Nico Varela was the reason grown men lowered their voices. He was tall and broad and dressed in a charcoal suit cut with lethal precision, and he carried a stillness so absolute the air seemed to thin around him. He was the head of a syndicate that owned the ports and the docks and the fear of every powerful family for 100 miles, a man rumored to end a life with a single unhurried nod. He rarely raised his voice. He had never once, in 4 years, come to the 14th floor. And now he was in her doorway, and Margot's heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Mr. Varela," she said, standing so fast she knocked over a cup of pens. "Sit down, Miss Winslow," he said, and closed the door. What he told her then was the last thing she expected. In 3 days there was a summit, a gathering of the 5 families in a private hall where alliances were made and men occasionally did not walk back out. And Kazimir Volkov, the head of the rival syndicate pressing at Nico's ports, intended to offer his own daughter in a marriage alliance. It was not a gift. It was a Trojan horse, a spy in Nico's house, a hand on his throat dressed up as a wedding. And refusing outright, in front of the commission, would be an insult that meant open war in the streets by morning. There was exactly one way to decline without bloodshed. A man already engaged could not be offered a bride. "I need a fiancée for one night," Nico said. "One appearance, one ring, and afterward you will be compensated in a way that changes your life." Margot stared at him. "Why me?" she managed. "There are 100 women in this city who would kill for that seat." "Because they are exactly the problem," Nico said, and his bluntness was almost clinical. "Any woman with a name would come with a family, an agenda, a price." He gestured at her, at the gray cardigan and the sensible shoes and the pens scattered across her desk. "You are safe, Miss Winslow. You have no ties, no ambitions, no leverage. You are the one person in my organization no one has ever looked at twice. You will walk in, stand beside me, and blend into the room, and by midnight it will be over." And there it was. Even now, even from him, Margot felt the old, familiar ache settle behind her ribs, because he had just paid her the highest compliment his world could offer, and it was still, at bottom, the same thing she had been told her entire life. You are forgettable. You will not be noticed. Please continue not existing, but do it beside me. She should have refused. But she thought about 4 years of being a lamp, and about a life she had shrunk to the size of a windowless room, and about the fact that this was, in all likelihood, the only interesting thing that would ever happen to her. So Margot Winslow, who had spent 31 years disappearing, lifted her chin and said yes. Nico slid a black card across her desk. Buy whatever you need, he said, rising. Something that will not draw attention. She had no idea she was about to break every single thing he had planned. The private hall of the Bellwether Club was a cathedral of dark wood and old money, and by the time Margot's car pulled up, every dangerous man on the eastern half of the city was already inside. Nico stood near the head of the long table making the small, lethal conversation of men measuring one another, and he was, though he would not have admitted it, mildly anxious. Not about Volkov, about whether his accountant would come at all, and whether she would fold under the weight of a room like this. Then the great doors opened, and Nico Varela forgot how to breathe. The woman who walked through them was not wearing a gray cardigan. She was poured into a gown of deep wine velvet that had clearly been made for her body rather than fought onto it, and it did not hide a single thing. It celebrated her. It moved with the full, lush curve of her hips, cinched at a waist he had never once seen, framed a bust that made two capos abruptly forget the ends of their sentences. Her hair, always scraped back, fell in dark waves. Her mouth was painted a red that belonged on a warning label, but it was not the dress. Nico had seen 1,000 beautiful women in gowns and felt precisely nothing. It was the way she walked. Margot Winslow, who had spent her whole life making herself small, came through that door and did not apologize to a single square foot of it. She did not scurry. She did not shrink. She crossed that floor as though the room had been built to hold her, and the entire hall of killers went quiet, and one by one, every powerful man in that room turned to watch her and did not stop watching. Volkov's head came up like a wolf catching a scent. His capos leaned in and murmured, and a strange, cold prickle went down the back of Nico's neck, because he had brought her here to be invisible, and instead she had walked in and rearranged the gravity of the room. Margot reached him and stopped, close enough that he caught a breath of her perfume. You're staring, Mr. Varela, she said quietly. He was. Every man in here is, he said. This was not the plan. She glanced at the crowd, then back at him, and there was something in her eyes he had never seen through 4 years of a windowless office, something dry and steady and faintly amused. You told me to blend in, she said. I did the math. There was no version of this where a woman engaged to you goes unnoticed, so I decided that if they were going to look at me anyway, they were going to look at me on my terms. Nico slid the ring onto her finger, a heavy, flawless thing that fit as though it had been measured for her, and his thumb brushed her knuckles a beat longer than the performance required. Then he offered his arm, and Margot Winslow took it, and together they walked into the most dangerous room in the city. He had chosen her because no one would look twice. Every single person there was about to spend the entire night unable to look away. Volkov made his move over the second course, the way old predators do, wrapped in courtesy. He rose with his glass and spoke warmly of unity, of the strength of joined houses, and then he gestured to his daughter, a pale, elegant girl seated at his right, and offered her to Nico Varela in front of the entire commission. It was masterful. Every man at that table understood that refusal meant blood. Nico set down his glass, and the temperature in the hall dropped 20 degrees, and before he could speak, Margot Winslow beat him to it. I'm flattered on his behalf, she said, and her voice, clear and unhurried, carried down the whole length of that table. But I'm afraid the position is filled. She lifted her left hand, unhurried, letting the ring catch the light, and the room made a low sound. Volkov's smile did not move, but his eyes did. And who? He said pleasantly, are you? Nobody, Margot said. That's rather the point, isn't it? I'm not a family, I'm not a treaty, and I don't come with a second set of books. She let the pause breathe. Speaking of which, Mr. Volkov, I couldn't help noticing your capo mention the Harrow Street terminal earlier. Congratulations on the expansion. Though it must be difficult carrying a terminal that's been operating at a 40% loss since March. Silence dropped over that table like a blade. Volkov's daughter went white. One of his kapos actually flinched. Because Margot, who had been a lamp in a room full of talking men for 4 years, had spent this entire evening doing what she always did, which was listen and add. And in 3 sentences, she had told the 5 families that Casimir Volkov's empire was bleeding, that his generous marriage alliance was the desperate grab of a man who needed Nico's ports to stay solvent, and that she had worked it out from table talk and a wine glass. Volkov's mouth opened and produced nothing. Down the table, the old bosses began, very quietly, to smile. Nico Varela sat perfectly still with his heart slamming against his ribs, and understood, with the clarity of a man watching a building come down, that he had brought a weapon into this room and called it camouflage. Later, in the corridor, Volkov intercepted them, and the courtesy was gone. "Charming," he said to Nico, his eyes crawling over Margot. "Where did you find her?" "The accounting pool." He laughed at his own joke. "Careful, Varela. Fat little bookkeepers with clever mouths have a way of ending up in the harbor." Nico did not raise his voice. He simply stepped between them, and something moved across his face that made the older man take a step back. "That woman," Nico said, his voice soft, silken, and absolutely lethal. "Just read your entire empire off a wine glass. She is worth more than your bloodline. If your shadow so much as falls on her, I will not go to war with you. I will let her do it, and she will not leave you enough to bury." And behind them, standing in the doorway with a drink in his hand and a smile that never reached his eyes, Nico's consigliere watched the whole exchange and understood that everything he had spent 2 years building had just walked into a ballroom in wine velvet. The man in the doorway was Julian, Nico's consigliere, the silver-tongued second who had served the family since Nico was young, and he had a problem. For 2 years Julian had been quietly on Volkov's payroll, feeding him shipping schedules, skimming the ports, laundering his cut through a maintenance shell buried so deep in the legitimate books that no one would ever find it. The marriage alliance had been Julian's idea. A Volkov girl in Nico's house meant a second pair of eyes and a second hand on the ledger, and eventually a quiet, natural-looking death and a smooth transition to a grateful new regime. It had been flawless. And then Nico, in a fit of tactical cleverness, had reached down into the 14th floor and pulled out the one human being on the payroll who could actually read the books. Julian smiled and began, very quietly, to plan. The soft, overlooked accountant, he was certain, would be the easiest thread to cut. It was the last mistake he would make as a free man. The night should have ended there. It did not. Nico drove her home himself, which he had never done for anyone, and in the dim cabin he poured a measure of amber whiskey from the console decanter and pressed it into her hands without asking. "Drink," he said. "Your hands are shaking." They were. Margot took a swallow, the burn steadying her, and let out a laugh that was half sob. "I told a mob boss his terminal was underwater," she said, "in front of 5 families. I think I've had a stroke." "You told him," Nico corrected, and every man in that room recalculated their entire understanding of my organization. He was quiet a moment, watching her. "For years," he said. "For years you sat in that office and let them take your work and put their names on it." "Why?" Margot looked out at the rain. "Because that's what a woman like me does," she said. "You keep your head down and you're useful, and eventually somebody lets you stay." Nico's jaw tightened. He reached across the seat and, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for such hands, tipped her chin up with one knuckle until she had to meet his eyes. "Look at me," he said. "I chose you because I thought you would disappear. That was the single stupidest miscalculation of my career. You did not disappear, Reina. You made the most dangerous men on this coast forget how to finish a sentence. Do not ever make yourself small again. Do you understand me?" Margot's breath caught. Something charged and unspoken filled the cab, and for one long moment his hand did not leave her jaw, his thumb brushing the softness of her cheek, and she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he only looked at her, memorizing her, and murmured good night, and left her standing in the rain outside her building with his ring still on her finger and her heart pounding like a girl's. The engagement was supposed to end at midnight. Neither of them mentioned the ring, and by morning, everything had changed, because a war does not politely wait for a contract to expire. Volkov, humiliated in front of the commission, moved against the ports within the week, and Nico did the thing that shocked his entire organization. He brought Margot Winslow out of the 14th floor and put her at his right hand. Not as decoration, as the person who would find the leak he now knew he had, because Volkov's men had been arriving at his terminals with schedules they could not possibly have had. He installed her in the fortress above the water, gave her the syndicate's entire tangled architecture, and told her to tear it open. And Margot, who had spent 4 years hiding her genius under a gray cardigan, felt something long-frozen crack apart in her chest. She was extraordinary. Within a week, she had mapped the whole rotten system. Every night, they worked side by side over that decanter of amber whiskey until the tall windows went gray with dawn, and Nico, who trusted no one, found himself telling her things he had never told another living soul, about the father he had buried and the trust he had learned to bury with him. He learned that she hummed when she was thinking. He learned that she flinched at raised voices and softened at kindness, and it made him want to burn her whole past to the ground. But the cruelty of that world was not finished with her. At a commission dinner 3 weeks later, a socialite named Celeste Vaughn, who had spent 2 years auditioning for the seat Margot now occupied, cornered her by the bar in front of an audience. "God, you're actually still here," Celeste said, letting her eyes rake over Margot's curves with theatrical pity. "Sweetheart, you do understand you're a prop?" He needed a decoy, and he grabbed the safest, plainest thing on the payroll. "Don't get attached to the ring. Nobody is going to look at you and see a queen." The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Nico did not raise his voice. He came up behind Margot, slid an arm around her waist, and looked at Celeste the way a man looks at something scraped off his shoe. "You are correct about one thing," he said. "I did choose her because I thought no one would look at her." He let the silence sit. "It was the stupidest thing I have ever believed, and I have believed some very stupid things. That woman took Casimir Volkov apart with a wine glass and a memory. What have you ever done but count another man's money?" Celeste's smile shattered. Nico bent his head to Margot's ear, his voice for her alone. "You never shrink in a room again, Reina," he murmured. "Not in my world, and never in front of me." But across the room, Julian was watching the way his boss looked at the accountant, and he understood that his time had just run out. That night, he made his move. The estate went dark at 2:30. Margot woke to a silence so absolute it felt like a held breath. The power was out. The generators, which should have caught in seconds, stayed dead. Nico was in the city, drawn away at midnight by an emergency at the docks, and Margot, standing barefoot in the dark, understood with terrible clarity that the emergency was a lie, and that whoever was in this house had come for her. She did not scream. She did not faint. She did not run blindly. She thought, cold and clear, the way she always had. 2 floors below, a silenced weapon coughed, and a body met the marble. Margot went to the study. She had spent 3 weeks in that room, and she knew 2 things the men on the stairs did not. She knew the wall safe held a hardwired satellite phone that did not depend on the house system. And she knew, because she memorized everything, that the study connected to the old servant's passage behind the bookcase. She reached the safe as boots hit the landing, entered the code Nico had trusted her with, and sent 1 line to the only number that mattered. Then she did something better than hide. She turned the house against them. She found the security panel on emergency battery and triggered the lockdown, slamming steel fire doors across the upper hallway, cutting the intruders in half, and sealing 2 of them in a corridor with no exit. Then she slipped into the passage and pulled the bookcase shut behind her as the study doors splintered inward. "Find the fat girl," a voice snarled. "Julian wants her breathing." And crouched in the dark with her heart slamming, Margot finally had the last number she needed. Julian. He came in himself, unhurried, certain, and spoke to the darkness as though he could feel her in it. "Come out, Margot," he said pleasantly. "You are a clever girl. You have worked out that I have been washing money through the maintenance accounts for 2 years. And you have surely worked out that the moment Nico sees what you found, I am a dead man. So you understand my position. Nothing personal. It's just accounting." He was 3 feet from the bookcase. And Margot, crouched in the dark, did the one thing he never expected. She spoke. "You should have checked the safe before you came looking for me, Julian," she said. Silence. "Because 6 days ago I sent everything to a dead man's switch," she continued, her voice steady and clear through the panel. "Every shell, every transfer, every schedule you sold to Volkov, primed to fire to Nico, and every capo in this family unless I cancel it myself. Kill me tonight, And you do not just lose your fortune. You expose yourself to the whole syndicate as a thief who stole from his own blood. Julian's certainty flickered. He had not planned for the accountant to be armed. And in his half-second of hesitation, the front gates below exploded inward with the tortured shriek of an engine pushed past its limits. Nico had come home. Time seemed to fracture. Gunfire erupted below, brief and brutal and absolute. Julian spun toward the sound, and Margot, seizing the only moment she would get, drove the bookcase open with her full weight. The heavy oak caught him square in the chest and sent him crashing backward over the desk, his weapon skidding into the dark. She did not stop. She lunged, kicked the pistol under a cabinet, and then the study doors were kicked off their hinges and Nico filled the doorway, soaked in rain, his suit ruined, his eyes wild and searching. Rocco and 4 armed men flooded in behind him, and the trap Julian had spent 2 years building snapped shut around him instead. Nico had him by the throat against the wall before the man could speak, and his voice was a lethal whisper. You raised your hand against her. Then he turned his head, and the murderous cold in his eyes dissolved into raw, naked fear. He released Julian to Rocco's men and crossed the room in 2 strides, his large hands moving frantically over Margot's arms, her face, her shoulders, checking for blood, for wounds, for any sign the world had hurt what was his. Are you hurt? He demanded, his breathing ragged, his voice cracking against her hair. Did he touch you? Look at me. Breathe. Tell me. I'm all right. Margot wept, finally letting the terror crash over her, her fingers twisting in his soaked lapels. I locked half his men in a hallway, and I hit the rest with a bookcase. Nico let out a broken, disbelieving laugh into her hair, and then he framed her tear-streaked face in his trembling hands and looked at her the way no one in her whole overlooked life had ever looked at her. You are magnificent, he breathed. My own men missed him for 2 years, and you found him from a windowless office. Then his voice cracked open entirely. I told you the engagement was one night, he said hoarsely. I have been lying to you and to myself every day since. It was never going to be one night. Not from the moment you came through that door. Julian, the man who had smiled at Nico for 15 years while selling him to his enemies, learned the price of underestimating them before the week was out. Nico did not act in blind rage. He let Margot lay the entire elegant crime before the commission, every shell company, every sold schedule, every dollar routed to Volkov, and when she finished, she looked at her champion and did not counsel death. You do not need to make him a martyr, she said quietly. You need to make him nothing. So they did it her way. They stripped Julian of every hidden asset, exposed his 2-year treason to the very families he had hoped to serve, and let them cast him out. He was left alive, bankrupt, disgraced, his name turned into a warning whispered across the underworld, a fate the old men agreed was far crueler than any quick and merciful bullet. And Volkov, whose bleeding empire Margot had exposed with a wine glass, discovered that she had spent 3 weeks doing to him what she had done to that terminal. She had traced his debts, his creditors, and the cartel he owed, and she simply, quietly, let them all learn the truth at the same time. His alliances evaporated. His capos defected. Within a season, the man who had threatened to put a bookkeeper in the harbor was bankrupt, powerless, and hunted by the people he had lied to, and Margot Winslow never once had to raise her voice. Celeste Vaughn, who had called her a prop, watched the seat she had auditioned for 2 years go to the plain accountant in the gray cardigan, and had to watch it from the far end of every table for the rest of her life. Months later, on a bright morning washed gold with new sun, Margot stood on the terrace of the fortress with a tablet on her arm, running the legitimate half of an empire that had never been cleaner or more powerful, and she was not hiding. She wore rich color now, tailored to celebrate every curve she had spent 31 years apologizing for, and she moved through that house not as a decoy, but as its center of gravity. Nico came out and stopped, simply watching her the way he had that first night through the ballroom doors. You're staring, Mr. Varela, she said without looking up, a smile in her voice. I will never stop staring at you, he said, crossing to her, taking the tablet gently from her hands and setting it aside. He drew her in, his hands finding her waist. I brought you into that room because I was certain no one would look at you twice. Reina, do you know what actually happened? He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch reverent. 300 years of underworld pecking order rearranged itself in 10 seconds because a woman finally walked into a room and refused to apologize for being in it. He tilted her chin up. They looked at you and saw something safe. I looked at you and saw the only person alive I would hand my entire empire to. Marry me for real, Margot. Not for one night. For every one of them. Margot looked up at the man the whole city feared. A man who bowed to no one and yet bowed, entirely, to her. And for the first time in her life, she believed she was exactly enough. She had been told she was forgettable, unremarkable, the safest, plainest thing on the payroll, and she had proven every last one of them wrong, because she alone had ever offered a ruthless man something real. He had picked her because he thought she would blend in. She had walked through that door and owned every inch of the room, and she had never given a single inch of it back. If Margot and Nico's story of hidden worth, fierce devotion, and hard-won vindication moved you, if you cheered when the overlooked accountant walked into a room full of killers and made every one of them nervous, then do us a small favor before you go. Smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that the person the world calls forgettable is so often the most dangerous one in the room. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another twist-filled tale of the underestimated soul who finally gets everything she deserves. And drop a comment below and tell us, what was your favorite moment in Margot and Nico's story?